The gunshot that shattered the evening silence sent 23-year-old Lily Thompson scrambling up the wooden ladder into the hayloft of the abandoned barn just outside Kingston, Arizona territory, her heart hammering against her ribs as she pressed herself deep into the dusty hay and prayed the men chasing her would ride past without stopping. She had been traveling alone for 3 weeks now, making her way west from Missouri after her father's death left her with nothing but debts and the clothes on her back. The stagecoach she'd been riding had been robbed 2 days earlier, and she'd managed to escape into the desert with only a canteen of water and the small satchel containing her mother's wedding ring and a few precious letters. The robbers had given chase, apparently angered that she'd run rather than staying put with the other passengers, and now here she was, hiding in a stranger's barn and wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, then seemed to pause right outside the barn. Lily held her breath, certain they could hear her thundering heartbeat from below. She heard voices, rough and angry, discussing which direction she might have gone. Then another voice cut through the evening air, this one deeper and calmer, carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "You boys looking for something on my property?" Lily carefully shifted in the hay, trying to peer through a crack in the wooden slats without making a sound. She could make out the silhouette of a man on horseback, broad-shouldered and sitting tall in the saddle, facing down the 3 men who'd been hunting her. "Just tracking some property that ran off from us," one of the robbers said. "Young woman, dark hair, probably came through here." "Haven't seen anyone," the stranger replied, his tone making it clear the conversation was over. "And I'd appreciate you moving along before you disturb my cattle any further." There was a tense moment of silence where Lily thought for certain the robbers would push back, would insist on searching the barn, but something in the stranger's voice must have convinced them otherwise. She heard the sound of horses being turned around, then the gradually fading thunder of hooves as they rode away. Lily waited, barely daring to breathe, as silence settled over the property again. She heard the stranger dismount, heard his boots hit the ground, heard him moving around below. Then his voice called up, startling her so badly she nearly gasped aloud. "You can come down now. They're gone." For a moment, Lily considered staying hidden, pretending she wasn't there at all, but the exhaustion of 3 weeks on the road and 2 days of running caught up with her all at once. She was tired, hungry, and desperately thirsty. Slowly, she made her way to the ladder and climbed down, her legs shaking with fatigue and fear. The man standing in the barn was tall, probably 30 years old, with dark hair and eyes that studied her carefully in the fading light streaming through the open doors. He wore dusty work clothes and a hat that had seen better days, but there was something solid and dependable about him that made Lily's racing heart slow just slightly. "Thank you," she managed, her voice hoarse from lack of water. "They've been chasing me since the stagecoach robbery." He nodded, taking in her disheveled appearance and the desperate look in her eyes. "You're safe now. Name's Frank Yates. This is my ranch, Lily Thompson." She swayed slightly on her feet and his hand shot out to steady her. "When did you last eat?" "Yesterday morning, maybe the morning before." "I'm not sure anymore." Frank Yates studied her for another moment, then seemed to make a decision. "Come up to the house. I'll get you some food and water." "I don't want to impose," Lily started, but her stomach chose that moment to growl loudly, betraying her. "It's no imposition. Can't have someone starving on my property." There was a hint of dry humor in his voice that made Lily look up at him more carefully. His face was weathered from sun and wind, with lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often, though he wasn't smiling now. He was looking at her with concern mixed with caution, as though he couldn't quite figure out what to make of her. Lily followed him out of the barn, noting the way he positioned himself between her and the direction the robbers had gone, as though still protecting her even though they were out of sight. The ranch house was a sturdy structure of wood and stone, larger than she'd expected, with a wide porch and windows that glowed with lamplight in the gathering dusk. Inside, the house was surprisingly well kept for a bachelor's residence. The furniture was simple but solid, and everything had its place. Frank gestured for her to sit at the kitchen table while he worked at the stove, building up the fire and pulling out supplies. "There's water in the pitcher there. Drink slowly or you'll make yourself sick." Lily poured herself a cup with trembling hands and forced herself to sip it despite her body's demands to gulp it down. She watched Frank move around the kitchen with practiced efficiency, slicing bread and cold meat, pulling out cheese and dried fruit. Within minutes, he'd set a plate in front of her that looked like a feast to her starved eyes. "Eat slowly," he advised again, settling into a chair across from her with his own cup of coffee. "You're safe here. No need to rush." Lily tried to follow his advice, but the food was so good after days of deprivation that she found it hard to pace herself. Frank didn't comment, just rose to refill her plate when she'd finished the first helping. It wasn't until she'd eaten her fill and was sipping a second cup of water that he spoke again. "Want to tell me what happened?" Lily wrapped her hands around the cup, drawing comfort from the cool ceramic. "My father died 6 weeks ago. Heart gave out. We had a small shop in Missouri, but it turned out he had debts I didn't know about. Creditors took everything. I had some money saved, enough for a stagecoach ticket west. Thought I might find work in California, maybe as a teacher or a seamstress. But the stage was robbed outside of town, and when I ran, they seemed to take it personally. They're probably long gone by now," Frank said. "Once robbers get what they're after, they usually clear out fast, but you're welcome to stay here tonight. I've got a guest room you can use." Lily looked at him in surprise. "I was just going to sleep in the hayloft. I don't want to be any trouble." "Sleep in the guest room instead," Frank said firmly. "The hayloft's no place for a lady, especially one who's been through what you have. The room's just sitting empty anyway." There was something in his tone that suggested he wouldn't take no for an answer, and truthfully, the thought of a real bed was almost overwhelming in its appeal. Lily felt tears prick at her eyes, surprising herself with the sudden rush of emotion. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know how I'll ever repay your kindness. No repayment needed. It's what decent people do." Frank stood, carrying their dishes to the basin. "I'll show you the room. There's a wash basin and clean water, and I'll see if I can find something cleaner for you to wear. My sister stays here sometimes when she visits from Tucson. She might have left some things." The guest room was small but comfortable, with a real bed covered in a patchwork quilt, a dresser, and a washstand with a large ceramic basin. Frank was true to his word, returning a few minutes later with a clean nightgown and a dress that looked like it would roughly fit Lily's frame. "Bathroom's at the end of the hall if you need it," he said from the doorway, his eyes carefully focused somewhere over her shoulder rather than directly at her. "I'll be up early to tend the cattle, but you sleep as long as you need. We can figure out what comes next in the morning." After he'd gone, Lily washed as best she could with the basin and water, then slipped into the borrowed nightgown. It was clean and soft, and she nearly wept again at the simple luxury of it. The bed was even better, the mattress actually stuffed with something more comfortable than corn husks, the quilts heavy and warm. She was asleep almost before her head hit the pillow. When Lily woke, sunlight was streaming through the window at an angle that suggested it was well past dawn. She sat up with a start, disoriented for a moment before the previous day's events came flooding back. The dress Frank had provided was draped over a chair, and she dressed quickly, braiding her dark hair as best she could without a mirror. The house was quiet when she emerged from the bedroom. She found the kitchen easily enough and was surprised to see a pot of coffee still warm on the stove and a covered plate of biscuits on the table with a note propped against it. "Help yourself. I'm out with the cattle, back around noon. Frank." Lily sat down slowly, studying the simple note. Frank Yates was clearly a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He'd taken her in without hesitation, fed her, given her his guest room, and was now leaving her alone in his house with apparent trust that she wouldn't rob him blind and disappear. The thought of repaying that trust by doing exactly that never even crossed her mind. Instead, she ate one of the biscuits, drank some coffee, and then set about trying to find some way to make herself useful. She washed the dishes from last night and this morning, then noticed the state of the kitchen floor and located a broom. By the time noon rolled around, she'd swept and scrubbed the kitchen, tidied the main room, and had started on the mending she'd found in a basket by the chair near the fireplace. She heard Frank before she saw him, his boots on the porch boards. He came in through the front door, pulling off his hat and stopping short when he saw the state of the house. "You didn't have to do all this," he said, but there was something in his voice that suggested he was pleased rather than upset. "I wanted to do something to thank you," Lily replied, setting down the shirt she'd been mending. "You've been so kind and I've been nothing but trouble." "You haven't been trouble." Frank hung his hat on the hook by the door and moved into the kitchen, pouring himself water from the pump. "But I appreciate the help. I'm not much for housekeeping." "I noticed you had that basket of mending," Lily said. "If you'd like, I could work on it. I'm actually quite good with a needle. I used to do alterations for the ladies in town back home." Frank studied her for a moment, and Lily got the sense he was considering something carefully. "I was thinking," he said slowly, "if you're still looking for work, I could use someone to help around here. Not just the housekeeping, though that would be appreciated. I've been trying to handle everything myself since my last hand left 2 months ago, and it's getting to be too much. I can't pay much, but room and board would be included, and it would give you a safe place to stay while you figure out your next steps." Lily felt hope flutter in her chest. "I don't know much about ranch work," she admitted. "You can learn, and there's plenty of other work that needs doing. Cooking, cleaning, mending, tending the kitchen garden, helping with the chickens and the milk cow. Things I don't have time for when I'm dealing with the cattle and horses." "I can do all those things," Lily said eagerly, "and I'd be happy to learn the rest." Frank nodded, something that might have been relief crossing his face. "Then we have an agreement. You can keep the guest room. I'll show you around the property this afternoon and we'll start fresh tomorrow." Over the next few weeks, Lily settled into life on the ranch with surprising ease. Frank was a patient teacher, showing her how to collect eggs without spooking the chickens, how to milk the cow, how to tend the garden that had been struggling without regular care. In turn, she brought order to the house, cooked meals that were actually edible rather than the burned and bland attempts Frank had been surviving on, and worked her way through the enormous pile of mending. They fell into an easy rhythm, working alongside each other during the day and sitting together in the evenings while Lily sewed and Frank read from the week-old newspapers he picked up in town. Sometimes they talked, and Lily learned that Frank had inherited the ranch from his father 5 years earlier, that his mother had died when he was young, and that his sister Alina had married a shopkeeper in Tucson and was expecting her first child. "I'm hoping she'll come stay here for a while after the baby's born," Frank said one evening. "She could use the rest, and I'd like to get to know my niece or nephew." "That would be lovely," Lily replied, focusing on the tear in the shirt she was repairing. "Do you have other family?" Some cousins back east, but we don't stay in close touch. Alina's really all I have left that matters. You, Lily shook her head. My mother died when I was 12. It was just my father and me after that, and now there's no one. She said it matter-of-factly, but Frank must have heard something in her voice because he looked up from his paper. You've got a place here as long as you want it, he said quietly. I hope you know that. The words settled something in Lily's chest, some tight knot of fear that had been living there since her father's death. She looked up, meeting Frank's eyes across the lamplit room, and smiled. Thank you, Frank. That means more than you know. As autumn deepened into winter, Lily found herself thinking less about moving on to California and more about the life she was building here in Kingston. The work was hard but satisfying, and she discovered she had a knack for the practical side of ranch management. She'd organized the storage shed, had started keeping records of supplies and expenses, and had even begun helping Frank with some of the business correspondence that piled up from buyers and suppliers. She'd also begun to notice things about Frank that had nothing to do with business or practicality. The way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, which he did more often now than when she'd first arrived. The strength in his hands when he helped her over rough ground or reached past her for something on a high shelf. The sound of his voice in the morning when he knocked on her door to wake her, always polite, always respectful of her privacy. It was a cold December morning when Lily finally admitted to herself that she'd fallen in love with Frank Yates. The realization came as she was watching him work with a young horse in the corral, his patience and gentleness evident in every movement. He talked to the animal in a low, soothing voice, never rushing, never forcing, just waiting for trust to build naturally. It was the same way he'd treated her, she realized. He'd given her space and time, had never pushed or demanded, had simply been there, steady and reliable and kind. The question was what to do about it. Lily had no way of knowing if Frank felt anything for her beyond appreciation for a good worker and perhaps some friendly affection. He'd never been anything but a perfect gentleman, never crossed any lines or made her feel uncomfortable. But sometimes she caught him looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, and sometimes his hand would linger just a moment longer than necessary when he helped her with something. She was still wrestling with these thoughts when Frank came in from the corral, brushing snow from his shoulders. The first real snowfall of winter had started an hour ago, and it showed no signs of stopping. "Looks like we're in for a good storm," Frank said, hanging up his coat. "I've secured everything in the barn and brought extra wood up to the porch. We should be fine for a few days if we get snowed in." "I'll make sure we have plenty of food prepared," Lily said, already mentally reviewing their supplies. "And I'll bake extra bread while the oven's hot." They worked together throughout the afternoon, Frank bringing in more firewood and checking on the animals while Lily cooked and baked, filling the house with warm, yeasty smells. By evening, the snow was coming down so thick they could barely see the barn from the house, and the wind was howling around the eaves. They ate dinner together at the kitchen table as they did every evening, but something felt different tonight. Maybe it was the storm raging outside, making the house feel even more like a sanctuary, or maybe it was the way the lamplight caught in Frank's dark hair and cast shadows that emphasized the strong lines of his face. Whatever it was, Lily found it hard to focus on her food. "You all right?" Frank asked, noticing her distraction. "Yes, just thinking about the snow," Lily said, which wasn't entirely untrue. "I've never seen a storm like this." "They can be fierce out here," Frank agreed, "but the house is solid, we'll be fine." After dinner, they settled into their usual evening routine, but Lily couldn't seem to focus on her mending. Her eyes kept drifting to Frank, and she kept thinking about how much her life had changed in the 3 months since she'd hidden in his hayloft. She'd gone from desperate and alone to safe and settled, with purpose and place. And somewhere along the way, this house had started to feel like home, and the man reading across from her had started to feel like so much more than an employer or even a friend. "Frank," she said suddenly, before she could talk herself out of it, "can I ask you something?" He looked up from his paper, giving her his full attention. "Of course. Why did you let me stay? That first night you could have sent me away or let me sleep in the barn, but you didn't. And then you offered me work when you could have just given me a meal and sent me on my way. Why?" Frank was quiet for a long moment, and Lily watched emotions flicker across his face too quickly to identify. Finally, he set down his paper and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Honestly, I'm not entirely sure I can explain it," he said slowly. "When I saw you climb down from that hayloft, exhausted and scared but trying so hard to be brave, something in me just knew I couldn't let you go. It wasn't pity, and it wasn't just about being neighborly. There was something about you, Lily. Something that made me want to know you better, to give you a reason to stay." Lily's heart was pounding so hard she was certain he must be able to hear it. "And now," she whispered. Frank stood, crossing the small distance between them and kneeling beside her chair so they were at eye level. "Now I can't imagine this place without you. You've become essential to everything here, to everything I do. And somewhere along the way, you became essential to me, too." "Frank," Lily breathed, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "I love you, Lily," Frank said, his voice rough with emotion. "I've been falling in love with you since that first night, and I know I should have kept it to myself, that you might not feel the same way, but I can't pretend anymore. You matter too much." Lily felt tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling. "I love you too," she said, reaching out to cup his face with her hands. "I've been so scared to say anything, so afraid I was reading everything wrong." Frank let out a breath that might have been a laugh or a sob or both, and then he was kissing her, soft and gentle at first, then deeper as she responded. His arms came around her, pulling her close, and Lily felt like she was finally, truly home. They broke apart after a long moment, both breathing hard, foreheads resting together. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside, everything was warm and perfect. "Marry me," Frank said, and it wasn't quite a question. "I know it's fast and we can wait if you want to, but I don't want to spend another day without knowing you're mine in every way that matters." "Yes," Lily said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, Frank, I'll marry you." They were married 3 weeks later by the Justice of the Peace in Kingston, with Frank's sister Alina and her husband making the difficult winter journey from Tucson to stand as witnesses. Alina took one look at the way her brother and his bride gazed at each other and declared it the most romantic thing she'd ever seen. "He's been alone for so long," Alina told Lily the night before the wedding, as they prepared dinner together in the ranch house kitchen. "I was starting to worry he'd never let anyone in, but you've made him so happy. I can see it in everything he does." "He's made me happy too," Lily replied, stirring the stew that was bubbling on the stove. "I was so lost when I came here, and he gave me everything. A home, a purpose, and his heart." The wedding was simple but perfect. Lily wore a dress that Alina had helped her sew from fabric Frank had surprised her with on a trip to town, a soft blue cotton that brought out her eyes. Frank wore his best suit, his hair neatly combed, his eyes never leaving Lily's face as they spoke their vows. That night, as they lay together in the bed that had once been just Frank's, Lily marveled at how her life had changed. 6 months ago, she'd been running for her life, alone and terrified. Now she was lying in the arms of the man she loved in a home they shared, with a future stretching out before them full of possibility. "What are you thinking about?" Frank murmured, his breath warm against her hair. "How lucky I am," Lily replied. "How everything terrible that happened led me here to you." Frank tightened his arms around her. "I'm the lucky one. You could have moved on to California, could have found work in town, but you stayed. You chose this life, chose me." "I'll choose you every day for the rest of my life," Lily said, tilting her head to kiss him. "You're everything I never knew I needed." Spring came to Kingston with a burst of wildflowers and new grass, and with it came change to the Yates ranch. Alina gave birth to a healthy boy in Tucson, and came to stay for a month with the baby, filling the house with the sounds of infant cries and Alina's exhausted but joyful laughter. Lily threw herself into helping her sister-in-law, learning everything she could about caring for babies, and secretly hoping it would be useful knowledge sooner rather than later. The ranch thrived under their joint management. Lily had taken over all the bookkeeping and correspondence, discovering she had a head for business that surprised even her. She'd negotiated a better price for their cattle with a buyer from Santa Fe, and had started a small side business selling her preserves and baked goods to the general store in town. Frank handled the physical work of the ranch, but they made all the major decisions together, true partners in every sense. It was a warm afternoon in late May when Lily realized she was pregnant. She'd suspected for a couple weeks, but it wasn't until Doc Harrison confirmed it on one of his rare trips through Kingston that she knew for certain. She hugged the secret to herself for the rest of the day, planning how to tell Frank in a way that would be special and memorable. That evening, after dinner, she took his hand and led him out to the porch, where they often sat and watched the sunset. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, and the air was filled with the sounds of cattle lowing in the distance and birds settling in for the night. "Frank," Lily said, her hand resting on his, "how would you feel about building an addition onto the house?" Frank looked at her in surprise. "An addition? The house seems plenty big for the two of us." "It might not be just the two of us for much longer," Lily said, unable to keep the smile off her face. She watched understanding dawn in Frank's eyes, watched them widen with shock and then fill with tears. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" "We're going to have a baby," Lily confirmed, and then she was being swept up in Frank's arms, spun around on the porch while he laughed with pure joy. "A baby," he kept saying, setting her down carefully as though she were made of glass. "We're going to have a baby. Lily, that's wonderful. That's the best news I've ever heard." They stood there together, wrapped in each other's arms, watching the sun sink below the horizon and painting their future in shades of gold and possibility. The pregnancy was not an easy one. By summer, the Arizona heat was oppressive, and Lily found herself exhausted and sick more often than not. Frank hovered constantly, much to her amusement and occasional exasperation, trying to take over all her chores and insisting she rest. "I'm pregnant, not dying," Lily said one particularly hot afternoon when Frank had tried to prevent her from hanging laundry. "I need to keep moving or I'll go crazy." "I just want to make sure you're safe," Frank protested. "You and the baby." Lily softened, seeing the real fear in his eyes. She took his face in her hands, making him look at her. "We're fine, Frank, I promise. Doc Harrison said everything is progressing normally. I'm strong and our baby is strong. You don't need to worry so much." But he did worry. Right up until a cold February morning when Lily woke him before dawn with the news that the baby was coming. Frank barely remembered to get dressed before running to fetch Doc Harrison and the midwife from town, leaving Lily in the care of Alina, who had insisted on coming to stay a month before the baby's due date. The labor was long and difficult. Frank paced the house like a caged animal, listening to Lily's cries from the bedroom and feeling utterly helpless. Alina came out periodically to reassure him that everything was progressing as it should, but he couldn't shake his fear that something would go wrong, that he'd lose her. It was late afternoon when the sound of a baby's cry finally rang through the house. Frank stopped mid-stride, his heart in his throat, waiting. Then Alina appeared in the doorway, her face wreathed in smiles. "Come meet your son," she said. Frank barely remembered crossing the room. All he knew was that suddenly he was beside the bed, looking down at Lily's exhausted, radiant face and the tiny bundle in her arms. "A boy," Lily whispered, looking up at him with tears in her eyes. "Frank, we have a son." Frank sat carefully on the edge of the bed, reaching out with trembling hands to touch the baby's soft head. His son. He had a son. The reality of it overwhelmed him, and he found himself crying, unable to stop the tears from falling. "He's perfect," Frank managed. "You're perfect." "Lily, I love you so much." "I love you too," Lily said, shifting the baby so Frank could hold him. "What should we name him?" They discussed names throughout the pregnancy but had never quite settled on one. Now, looking at his son's face, Frank knew immediately. "James," he said. "After your father." Lily's eyes filled with fresh tears. "James Frank Yates," she said. "It's perfect." Young James proved to be a healthy, happy baby with a strong set of lungs and his mother's dark hair. The ranch settled into a new rhythm, organized around feedings and naps and the constant wonder of watching their son grow. Frank had never known he could feel this much love, that his heart had this much capacity for joy. When James was 6 months old, Alina and her husband came for a visit, bringing their own son, Thomas, who was now a rambunctious toddler. The house was chaos and noise and laughter, everything Frank had never realized he wanted. "You're happy," Alina observed one evening when they'd finally gotten both children to sleep and were sitting on the porch enjoying the relative quiet. "I am," Frank agreed. "Happier than I ever thought possible." "I'm glad," Alina said, reaching over to squeeze his hand. "You deserve this, Frank. You and Lily both." The years passed in a blur of seasons and milestones. James took his first steps on a spring morning when the wildflowers were blooming. He spoke his first word on a summer afternoon during a thunderstorm. He learned to ride on a gentle mare when he was 4, with Frank walking beside him the whole time and Lily watching from the porch, her hands pressed to her mouth in fear and pride. When James was 5, Lily discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, and when their daughter was born on a warm September evening, it felt like their family was complete. They named her Sarah, after Frank's mother, and she had her father's eyes and her mother's spirit. Frank expanded the ranch over the years, buying adjacent land as it became available, building up their herd, establishing a reputation for quality cattle and fair dealing. But no matter how busy he got, he always made time for his family. He taught James everything about running a ranch, but he also read to him every night and listened to his dreams of seeing the ocean someday. He doted on Sarah, who wrapped him around her little finger from the moment she was born. Lily continued to manage the business side of the ranch, and her little enterprise selling preserves and baked goods grew into a proper business that employed several women from town. She'd found her purpose not just in being a wife and mother, but in building something of her own, in helping other women find work and independence. On a warm evening in late spring, 20 years after the night Lily had first hidden in their barn, Frank and Lily sat on the porch watching the sunset, just as they had countless times before. James was 20 now, strong and capable, essentially running the ranch alongside Frank. Sarah was 15, clever and spirited, already talking about going to the new teaching college that had opened in Tucson. "You ever think about that night?" Frank asked, his hand finding Lily's as naturally as breathing. "When you climbed down from the hayloft?" "All the time," Lily replied, lacing her fingers through his. "I was so scared, so certain my life was over. I never could have imagined it was actually just beginning." "I saw you and knew I couldn't let you go," Frank said. "Best decision I ever made asking you to stay." "Best decision I ever made was saying yes," Lily replied. She turned to look at him, seeing the silver in his hair, the deeper lines around his eyes, but also seeing the same man who'd offered her safety and kindness when she'd needed it most. "I love you, Frank Yates. Just as much now as I did that first winter when we admitted how we felt." "I love you too," Frank said, pulling her close. "More than I did then, if that's possible. You've given me everything, Lily. A home, a family, a life worth living." They sat there together as the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in familiar shades of gold and pink. Inside the house, they could hear James and Sarah arguing good-naturedly about something, their voices carrying through the open windows. Soon they'd be called in for dinner, and the evening would unfold in its usual comfortable pattern. But for now, Frank and Lily just sat together, hand in hand, two people who'd found each other by chance and stayed together by choice. The ranch spread out around them, prosperous and peaceful, built on hard work and love, and the decision one rancher had made 2 decades ago to offer shelter to a desperate young woman sleeping in his hayloft. As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Frank squeezed Lily's hand and she squeezed back. No words were needed. After 20 years together, they could communicate entire conversations with just a touch. But Frank spoke anyway, because some things deserve to be said out loud. "Thank you for choosing this life, for choosing me." Lily leaned her head on his shoulder, contentment filling every part of her being. "Every single day, Frank, I choose you every single day." And as the night settled around them, bringing with it the familiar sounds of the ranch they'd built together, Frank and Lily Yates sat on their porch and counted their blessings, grateful for every moment that had led them here, to this perfect life they'd created together in the wild, beautiful Arizona territory they called home. The next morning brought news that would test their peaceful existence. Frank was in town picking up supplies when he ran into Sheriff Martinez, who pulled him aside with a serious expression. "Frank, thought you should know. Those robbers from years back, the ones who held up the stage your wife was on, they got released from prison last week. Word is they've been asking questions about Kingston, about what happened to the woman who got away." Frank felt his blood run cold. After all this time. "Apparently they convinced themselves she made off with more than she did, or they're just mean enough to hold a grudge," the sheriff said. "I doubt they'll actually come here, but I wanted you to be aware. Keep an eye out." Frank thanked the sheriff and headed home, his mind racing. He didn't want to worry Lily, but he could not tell her. When he got back to the ranch, he found her in the garden with Sarah, teaching their daughter about which herbs were ready for harvesting. After Sarah had gone inside, Frank told Lily about his conversation with the sheriff. He watched the color drain from her face, saw fear flicker in her eyes for the first time in years. "They're coming here," Lily whispered. "We don't know that," Frank said firmly, taking her hands. "And even if they do, they're not getting anywhere near you or our children. I promise you that, Lily. I protected you then, and I'll protect you now." Over the next few days, Frank made preparations without alarming James and Sarah. He cleaned and loaded his rifles, had several conversations with the hands who worked the ranch, and made arrangements with Sheriff Martinez to be alerted if any strangers came to town. It was James who spotted them first. He came riding in fast from the western pasture, his face flushed with exertion. "Pa, there's 3 men on the ridge. They're just sitting there watching the house." Frank felt rage and fear battle in his chest, but he kept his voice calm. "Go inside. Tell your mother to get Sarah into the root cellar. You stay with them." "Pa, I can help," James protested. "You can help by protecting your mother and sister," Frank said firmly. "That's what I need from you right now, James. Can you do that?" James hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, sir." Frank waited until his family was secure, then walked out to meet the 3 men who were now riding slowly toward the house. He recognized them from that night 20 years ago, older now, harder, with the look of men who'd spent years in prison and come out worse for it. "You're on private property," Frank called out when they were close enough. "Time to move along." The leader, a scarred man with cold eyes, shook his head. "We've got business here. There's a woman who owes us and we aim to collect." "There's no one here who owes you anything," Frank said, his hand resting on his gun belt. "And you've got about 10 seconds to turn around before I make you." "Big talk for one man alone," the scarred man said. "He's not alone." The voice came from behind Frank, and he recognized it as belonging to Tom Richardson, his lead ranch hand. Looking around, he saw that the other hands had also appeared, spread out in a loose semicircle, all armed. "This is a working ranch with working men who don't take kindly to threats," Tom continued. "And the sheriff's on his way. Funny thing about Kingston, we take care of our own here. Mrs. Yates is one of ours." The 3 men exchanged glances, clearly reassessing their chances. In the distance, Frank could see dust rising from the road, riders approaching fast. The sheriff, true to his word. The scarred man spat on the ground, but he was already turning his horse. "Ain't worth it," he muttered. "Just a stupid woman anyway." They rode off, and Frank watched them go until they were out of sight, his heart still racing. Then he was running to the house, to the root cellar, pulling open the door to find Lily standing at the bottom of the stairs with a rifle in her hands and their children behind her. "It's okay," he said, his voice shaking. "They're gone. You're safe." Lily set down the rifle and climbed the stairs, throwing herself into Frank's arms. He held her tight, feeling her trembling against him. "I was so scared," she whispered. "Not for me, but for you. Frank, if something had happened to you because of me." "Nothing happened," Frank said firmly. "And nothing is going to happen. We're all safe. That's what matters." Sheriff Martinez arrived with 2 deputies, and they tracked the 3 men to the county line, making it clear they weren't welcome to return. Over the next few weeks, Frank received word that they'd been picked up for robbery 2 counties over and would be going back to prison for a long time. The incident shook Lily more than she wanted to admit. Frank would wake in the night to find her at the window, looking out at the moonlit ranch, and he knew she was watching for danger that was no longer there. "Talk to me," he said one night, coming to stand behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "Tell me what you're thinking." "I'm thinking about how much I have to lose now," Lily said quietly. 20 years ago, I had nothing. If those men had caught me, it would have been terrible, but it would have only affected me. Now I have you and James and Sarah. I have this beautiful life. The thought of anything threatening that terrifies me. That's what it means to love," Frank said gently. "To have something worth protecting, worth fighting for. Yes, it makes you vulnerable, but it also makes you strong. Look at you, Lily. You were ready to defend our children with your own hands. That's not weakness, that's fierce love." Lily turned in his arms, looking up at him with tears in her eyes. "How did I get so lucky to find you?" "We found each other," Frank corrected. "And we've built something beautiful together. Don't let fear take that away from you. Those men are gone. Our life is here, and it's good." Slowly, over the following months, Lily's fear faded, replaced by renewed appreciation for everything they had. She threw herself back into her work and her family, determined not to waste a moment of the precious life they'd built. Sarah's 16th birthday brought a surprise. A young man from town, the son of the banker, began calling on her, and Frank found himself having to come to terms with the fact that his little girl was growing up. He sat on the porch cleaning his rifle a bit more obviously than necessary whenever the boy came around, much to Sarah's embarrassment and Lily's amusement. "You're going to terrify that poor young man," Lily said, watching from the doorway. "Good," Frank replied. "He should be terrified. My daughter's the most precious thing in the world." "After me, I hope," Lily said, laughing. Frank set down the rifle and pulled her onto his lap, kissing her thoroughly. "You're in a category all your own, Mrs. Yates. Have been since the day I met you." James, meanwhile, had met a young woman at a dance in town, a sweet girl named Mary who came from a farming family. Frank liked her immediately, saw the way she looked at his son with genuine affection, the way she wasn't afraid of hard work or the isolation of ranch life. "I think I want to marry her, Pa," James confessed one evening while they were working together to repair a fence. "Then you should ask her," Frank said. "Life's too short to wait when you found the right person. I knew your mother was meant to be mine from the first night I met her. Took me a few months to work up the courage to say so, but I knew." James smiled. "She tells the story differently. Says you knew, but she was the one who had to make the first move." "We remember it differently," Frank said diplomatically, though Lily's version was probably closer to the truth. "Point is, we both knew, and we didn't waste time once we admitted it. If Mary's the one, don't let fear hold you back." James proposed a month later, and Mary said yes. The wedding was planned for spring, and the house was once again filled with excited planning and preparation. Lily had never been happier, surrounded by her growing family, watching her children step into their own lives. The wedding was beautiful, held on the ranch with half of Kingston in attendance. Frank stood beside his son, his heart full to overflowing, and thought about how far they'd all come. When the preacher pronounced James and Mary husband and wife, and his son kissed his new bride, Frank felt Lily's hand slip into his and squeeze. "We did good," she whispered. "We did perfect," Frank replied. James and Mary built a house on the far end of the ranch property, and within a year, they made Frank and Lily grandparents. Little Frank Jr. was born on a warm summer morning, and when Frank held his grandson for the first time, he understood in a new way the depth of love that was possible in this life. Sarah finished her schooling and, to everyone's surprise, announced she wanted to stay in Kingston and open a school rather than going to Tucson. The young banker's son, whose name was William, proposed, and Sarah accepted. They were married in a quiet ceremony, and within 2 years, they'd given Frank and Lily 2 more grandchildren, twin girls who had their grandmother's spirit and their grandfather's eyes. The ranch continued to prosper under the combined management of Frank and James. They expanded into horse breeding, with Sarah's husband contributing business expertise that helped them break into new markets. Lily's preserve business had grown large enough that she'd built a separate building just for production, employing a dozen women and shipping products as far as California. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Frank surprised Lily with a trip. They left the ranch in James's capable hands and took the train to San Francisco, something they'd always talked about but never done. "I can't believe we're really doing this," Lily said as the train pulled out of the station. "I can't remember the last time we were away from the ranch for more than a day." "We've earned it," Frank said, settling back in their seat with his arm around her shoulders. 25 years of hard work, time to see something new." San Francisco was overwhelming and exciting, so different from the wide open spaces they were used to. They stayed in a hotel with running water and electric lights, walked along the waterfront, ate in restaurants where they didn't know a single person. It was strange and wonderful, but by the end of the week they were both ready to go home. "Nothing compares to the ranch," Lily said as they boarded the train for the return journey, "to our life there." "Nothing ever could," Frank agreed. When they arrived back in Kingston, they were greeted by their entire family. 3 generations gathered on the ranch to welcome them home. Frank stood on his porch, surrounded by his wife, his children, his grandchildren, and felt overwhelming gratitude for the life he'd lived. That evening, after everyone had gone home and it was just Frank and Lily again, they sat on the porch as they had so many times before. The ranch was quiet, the cattle settled, the stars bright overhead. "You ever wonder how things might have gone differently?" Lily asked. "If I'd slept in the hayloft that night instead of accepting your offer of the guest room, I think I would have found a way to convince you to stay anyway," Frank said. "Some things are meant to be, Lily. We were meant to be." "I believe that," Lily said softly. "From that very first night when you looked at me with such kindness, even though I was a stranger who'd brought trouble to your door, I felt like I'd found something I'd been searching for without knowing it." "Home," Frank said simply. "You'd found home." "I'd found you," Lily corrected. "Home is wherever you are." Frank pulled her close, and they sat there together, 2 people who'd built a life from nothing but love and determination and faith in each other. The ranch they'd created stood as a testament to what was possible when 2 people truly partnered together, when they worked side by side toward common goals and supported each other through every challenge. As they grew older, Frank and Lily gradually turned over more responsibilities to James and Mary, though they never fully retired. Frank still rode out to check on the cattle most days, though now he took his grandson with him, teaching young Frank Jr. the same things he'd taught James all those years ago. Lily continued to oversee her business, though she'd promoted one of her longtime employees to manager and now mostly consulted and planned new products. Sarah's school thrived, and she and William added 2 more children to their family, keeping everyone busy with constant visits and family gatherings. The ranch house was never quiet anymore, always filled with the sound of children laughing and playing, exactly as Frank had sometimes dreamed it might be during those lonely years before Lily came into his life. On their 30th anniversary, the family threw a huge celebration. Everyone from Kingston came, along with Alina and her family from Tucson. There was dancing and food and speeches, and Frank found himself genuinely moved by the outpouring of affection from their community. "You and Lily are what this town is built on," Sheriff Martinez said, raising a glass in toast. "Hard work, fair dealing, and genuine kindness. You've set an example we all try to live up to." Later, when the party had wound down and most guests had gone home, Frank and Lily danced alone on the porch by lamplight, moving slowly to music only they could hear. "30 years," Lily murmured, her head on Frank's shoulder. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like we've always been together." "Both, I think," Frank said. "That's the magic of it. Every day with you is new, but you've also always been part of me." They danced until the moon rose high, until they were the only 2 people in the world, moving together as they'd moved together through everything life had thrown at them for 3 decades. The years continued to pass, bringing both joy and sorrow. Frank's sister Alina died peacefully in her sleep at 68, and Frank mourned the loss of his last connection to his childhood. But he had Lily and their children and grandchildren, and their love carried him through the grief. When Frank was 62 and Lily 60, James and Mary gave them news that made them laugh with delight. They were going to be grandparents again, for the 10th time. Their family had grown beyond anything Frank had imagined in those early days, and every addition brought new joy. Frank's hair had gone completely silver, and Lily's dark hair was threaded with white. They moved a little slower than they once had, and Frank's knee ached when it rained. But the love between them had only deepened with time, had become something so fundamental to who they were that neither could imagine existence without the other. On a warm spring evening, when Frank was 65 and Lily 63, they sat on their porch watching yet another spectacular Arizona sunset. They'd watched thousands of them together by now, but Frank never tired of it, never took for granted the blessing of having Lily by his side. "I've been thinking," Lily said, her hand in Frank's as always, "about that girl who hid in your barn all those years ago. Sometimes she feels like a different person, someone I used to know but am no longer." "How so?" Frank asked. "She was so scared," Lily said thoughtfully. "So certain she'd lost everything and had no future. She couldn't see past the next day, the next hour. She had no idea that the best parts of her life were just beginning. If you could go back and tell her anything, what would it say?" Lily was quiet for a moment, considering. "I'd tell her to have faith. That the man who offers her kindness when she most needs it will become the love of her life. That she'll find not just a home but a purpose. That she'll build something beautiful and lasting. That she'll know joy beyond anything she can imagine." Frank raised her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. "And what would you tell me? The lonely rancher who was too stubborn to admit he needed someone. I'd tell you that taking a chance on a desperate stranger will be the best decision you ever make," Lily said with a smile. "That opening your heart will transform your life in ways you can't foresee, that you'll never regret choosing love." "Not once," Frank confirmed. "Not for a single moment in 43 years have I regretted asking you to stay." They sat together as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in familiar shades of gold and orange and pink. Inside the house, they could hear the sounds of family. James and Mary had come for dinner with several of the grandchildren, and the house was filled with the warm chaos they'd come to associate with their family. But out here on the porch, it was just the two of them, as it had been from the beginning. Two people who'd found each other against all odds, who'd built a life together from nothing but determination and love, who'd raised a family and created a legacy that would continue long after they were gone. "I love you, Lily Yates," Frank said, as he'd said thousands of times before and would say thousands of times more. "More today than yesterday, less than I will tomorrow." "I love you, Frank Yates," Lily replied, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Thank you for seeing me that night in the hayloft. Thank you for offering me the guest room. Thank you for asking me to stay. Thank you for saying yes," Frank whispered. As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, and the sounds of their family carried through the open windows, Frank and Lily Yates sat hand in hand on the porch of the ranch they'd built together, grateful for every moment that had led them here, to this perfect life they'd created in the wild, beautiful Arizona territory. Their story had begun with a desperate woman hiding in a hayloft and a rancher who chose kindness. And it had become something neither of them could have imagined: a love that had lasted more than 4 decades. A family that had grown to include children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And a ranch that stood as a testament to what two people could build when they worked together with love and faith and determination. And as they sat there together, watching the night sky fill with stars, both knew that even though they couldn't see what tomorrow would bring, as long as they faced it together, everything would be exactly as it should be.